Je déclare ouverte.
I'd like to call this Senate Standing Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce to order. The committee is holding its fourth meeting as part of its study on the use of digital currency. The committee has heard so far from the Department of Finance Canada, an economic historian, a professor at Rothman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and the Bank of Canada. During the first hour of this meeting, we will receive a presentation from Mr. Jeremy Clark. Welcome, Mr. Clark, Assistant Professor at the Institute for Information Systems Engineering at Concordia University. Mr. Clark's research includes applied cryptography, Bitcoin, and security and network communications. He has contributed to many projects and publications in these fields. Mr. Clark, on behalf of the committee, thank you for accepting the invitation to appear before us. Welcome from the committee. I think you are well qualified to help us to better understand the issue that we are studying, in particular in relation to Bitcoin. The floor is yours.
I'll move to question and answer. So, Ms. Deputy Chair and committee members, it's my pleasure to present to you today on the subject of virtual currencies. My background was mentioned, but I'll just remind you that I'm an assistant professor in information systems engineering at Concordia University. I received my PhD in 2011 from the University of Waterloo. My research is in the areas of cryptography and cybersecurity. So given my expertise, I feel I can best assist you by providing the technical details of how Bitcoin and other virtual currencies work, with a particular emphasis on the math-based currencies like Bitcoin. Bitcoin has been a research area of mine for several years. I'm not an economist, nor do I have extensive public policy experience. However, it's my belief that successful regulation in these other areas require an accurate understanding of the technology. So if we broadly define digital currencies, we may include things like online credit card transactions, interact by email, online bill payments, cashing checks with a camera phone, etc. It's important to note that each of these consists actually of two transactions. There's a digital transaction that we see as users, and this merely authorizes the payment. Then behind the scenes, a second transaction occurs, which actually moves the money around. It actually settles the account. And this second transaction is not necessarily a digital transaction. Therefore, I would consider these digital authorizations not necessarily digital currencies. In contrast, the class of what I'll call math-based currencies, the digital transaction the user initiates actually authorizes, clears, and settles the transaction. So the currency actually moves from the sender's account to the receiver's account. The preeminent math-based currency is Bitcoin. However, it's a large umbrella that covers other established currencies like Ripple, Litecoin, and Purecoin, as well as new experimental currencies like Mastercoin and Ethereum. Okay, so now I'll go through a couple of the major properties that Bitcoin has. Many of these are shared with other math-based currencies. And in certain cases, you'll need more context to judge whether these are good properties or bad properties. I'm just going to neutrally say what the properties are, and you can interpret them however you like. So the primary property, I suppose, that Bitcoin has is it has a decentralized ledger. So it's important to understand this property. It's important to understand that Bitcoins aren't bearer instruments in the sense that you cannot possess a Bitcoin, digitally or otherwise. What you possess is a cryptographic key that gives you signing authority over an account. You can think of accounts as having a unique number. I'll refer to them as Bitcoin addresses. Technically, they correspond to a public key in a digital signature scheme. The ledger keeps track of every inflow and outflow associated with every Bitcoin address. And every outflow has to be signed for by the person who has signing authority over that account. The ledger is updated and maintained by a decentralized network of computers, and there's no entity in charge of this process. So that's why I call it a decentralized ledger. The second property, Bitcoin uses secure cryptography. So for my work in cryptography and reading the literature, what I've seen is that cryptographic algorithms, when they break, they tend to do so slowly over many years, with theoretic attacks eventually leading to practical attacks. In terms of the specific cryptographic primitives that Bitcoin uses, we haven't seen any indication even of theoretic attacks against those primitives. That said, it's unlikely it's going to remain secure forever. So if we think long term, maybe 5 decades or something like that, it may be time to transition the encryption algorithms that underlie the currency, but that's completely possible with the way the currency is set up. Okay, the third property is short transaction delays. So transactions first require an internet connection. And as an aside, this is a reason why I don't think Bitcoin will ever replace standard currency or ever become the national currency of any country. So given that you have an internet connection, what you do is you send your transaction to the network of computers that are maintaining this decentralized ledger. And just like email, you can do a Bitcoin transaction any time of day or any day of the year. After you hit send, the network learns of the transaction nearly instantly. The transaction will be grouped together with other active transactions, and the transaction set, which is referred technically to as a block, will be added to the ledger of all transactions, which technically is called a blockchain. This process typically takes 10 minutes. So it takes about 10 minutes to bundle together all the transactions and add them to the ledger. And then within an hour after sending the transaction and having it added to the ledger, the transaction will be deep enough in the ledger that it's highly unlikely that it will be subject to a reorganization of transactions. And reorganizations do tend to happen, but they happen right at the tail end of the ledger. Okay? So the bottom line is that transactions can be recognized instantly and finalized with high certainty within an hour. As a party to a transaction, you can choose to wait only for the transaction to reach the network, or if you want, you can wait the full hour for full confirmation, or you can wait any time in between. The decision basically comes down to how much trust you have for your counterparty. As I mentioned, the transaction actually moves the money. Okay, so even at an hour at the longest, that's a very short transaction for something that actually moves and settles accounts. Okay, the next property is low transaction fees. Fees for Bitcoin, they're technically voluntary. However, popular Bitcoin software by default will include fees. The way that you calculate fees is a very nuanced calculation, but you can think of something like 5 cents for a standard transaction. The fees do not depend on how much Bitcoin is being sent. They only depend on how big the digital representation of the transaction is, so how much work the computers do have to do to process and verify the transaction. So low transaction fees enables everything from remittance, overseas workers sending money home, to things like microtransactions. So you could imagine paying 10 cents to read a newspaper article online. The next property, transactions are irreversible. Once the transaction is in the ledger, it can't be reversed, even if it's widely known to be, for example, stolen money. However, because there's a ledger-based system, transactions are traceable. So there are cases, for example, where money traced to a theft was deposited with a web service, and that web service promptly returned it to the original owner. Okay, the next property has to do with anonymity. Anonymity is one of probably the most misunderstood parts of Bitcoin. So technically, the term we use is pseudonymous. So we say that transactions are pseudonymous or pseudonymous. As we've established, transactions are associated with an account number or a Bitcoin address. The link between the address and the account holder is not known by default. However, it can be established. So many users or companies will say what their Bitcoin address is so that they can receive payments. Other people might purchase things with Bitcoins and then have it shipped to a physical address. So now you know the link between the physical address and the Bitcoin address. There's also more indirect methods of linking addresses to identities. As mentioned, Bitcoin transactions are sent from a computer. Computers themselves, when they're online, they have a pseudonym, which is called an IP address. And internet service providers maintain a link between which customers have an IP address at which time. So there's interest in both strengthening and weakening Bitcoin's anonymity depending on your perspective. Arguments in favor of strengthening it would be to provide better consumer privacy. It would also protect businesses from corporate espionage, or the fact that they're basically opening up their books to all their competitors to look at all their inflows and their outflows. The arguments in favor of weakening it basically comes down to allowing law enforcement to do their job more effectively. In short, the way I think of it, Bitcoin is more anonymous than the banking system, but less anonymous than cash. Okay, the next property has to do with mining. Here, what I mean, mining technically has different definitions, but what I mean is the minting of new currency. This is also a misunderstood property of Bitcoin, I think. So mining is not at all a central component to Bitcoin. In fact, Bitcoin is designed to work without mining at all. What mining does is it just simply solves the problem of who you give the initial set of Bitcoins to in a fair and equitable manner. So the decision of the designer was that they would give it to the computers that were doing the work of maintaining the ledger. However, when you look at how this is actually used, what these miners do is they tend to subsidize the transaction fees that they're charging. So really it's the end users who are sending transactions that benefit the most from mining. The inflation rate is programmed into the currency. So Bitcoin mining is capped. And this is a design decision of Bitcoin specifically. It's not inherent to math-based currency. So if you didn't want a cap on the amount of currency, if you wanted to just inflate forever, that's something totally that you could do. With Bitcoin, the cap is 21 million Bitcoins. This is sometimes misinterpreted as 21 million units of currency. You should remember that Bitcoins are divisible to 8 decimal points. So what you really have is 2.1 quadrillion units of the smallest transactional amount. The final property is one that we're still coming to grips with even as researchers. And that's the fact that Bitcoin gives you what we call programmable money. So if you think about a check, you have a 2-line, and you basically have 2 choices. You can leave it blank, which says that anyone can cash it, or you can specify a single person and that single entity can cash it. In Bitcoin, what you can imagine is that in that 2-line, you can write a little computer program that describes sets of or the properties of the entities that could redeem the transaction, or the exact set of conditions under which this redemption would be possible. Okay, so this leads to all sorts of novel applications. Escrow transactions, 2 out of 3 signatures, bonds, payments for computation, and other things that sometimes are called smart contracts. So this is currently a very active area of development with math-based currencies. I don't think we understand the full potential of what this will allow at this point. It really is a new paradigm for currencies. So that concludes the properties that I want to mention. I know that the interest in this room is mainly on points of regulation. So what I'll do is I'll just say where I think regulation may be appropriate. This isn't my opinion. I'm not encouraging anything. These are just areas that people have identified as potential points of regulation. So in terms of consumer protection, keys, the signing keys that give you signing authority, they frequently get stolen. They're typically on your computer, and anyone who, if you get malware or if someone hacks your computer, they get stolen. And consumers typically will go to their local police in the case of theft, and local police probably don't want to deal with these types of things. So it may be interesting to think of what better options we could have for people who have their keys get stolen. There's exchanges which exchange currency, like fiat currency, like Canadian dollars, into Bitcoin. They go bankrupt more often than we'd like, so we could think maybe of bankruptcy insurance or some security auditing of these firms. There's also no guarantees that the exchanges are providing the best execution of orders, so we may want to look at establishing market rules for exchanges. Exchanges also sometimes operate in a data center. So what that means is the exchange is basically a website, and this website is being hosted by a third party. And there was a case recently right here in Ottawa where the data center gave unauthorized access to the exchange computer, resulting in a $100,000 theft. And so we have to think about what kind of liability we want data centers to have for hosting exchanges as well. In terms of money laundering, so I can use Bitcoin to move large amounts of money overseas. There's no limits on the countries. Bitcoin doesn't have any concept of what countries are or what borders are. In order to get Bitcoins out of Canada, typically it would probably be in cash, and so I'd have to go through an exchange in order to turn them into Bitcoins. And so, you can consider exchanges to be money service businesses, and then make them subject to the standard laws like know your customer, reporting certain types of transactions, etc. In terms of illicit transactions, it's important to remember that Bitcoin transactions are packets on the internet. Okay, so they're not any different than other types of illicit packets that law enforcement is interested in tracking. They're already involved in lots of cat and mouse games of tracking illicit information online. The most notable case, I guess, for illicit transactions is called Silk Road, where you could purchase illegal things like drugs and weapons. It's important to know that in the case of Silk Road, Bitcoin was just one component of a larger system. So if you just had Bitcoin, you couldn't do Silk Road. You also need ways of anonymizing users in terms of their internet traffic. You basically have to put a server up, and you have to have it so that nobody knows where that server is located. So somehow you can visit the server over the internet and yet not know where it's located. And so that used a very sophisticated piece of technology called Tor Hidden Services. And then if you want things that are shipped that are illicit, you probably want it shipped to a sort of anonymous address, like a PO box. So Silk Road's an example of really a combination of technologies that came together in order to make that possible. And of course, law enforcement was able to get to the bottom of it and make arrests in that case. The final category is taxation. This I know the least about. In terms of taxation, I guess I see it mainly as a classification issue. What does Bitcoin fall under? And I'm not sure what the answer is there. So economists would probably have a better opinion than I would on that. So in conclusion, we're in the early adopter phase of math-based currencies. It's hard to assess their true potential at this point. However, a low-fee international pipeline for financial transactions that's akin to sending an email is an important innovation in and of itself without getting into the more futuristic possibilities of a programmable currency. Small businesses in the sector are growing with significant innovation happening right here in Canada. We have to be careful not to stifle innovation while addressing the legitimate concerns banks and law enforcement have with math-based currencies. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess try to follow you. I hope my colleagues have all picked up all the points that you raised, but maybe we have a few questions to clarify these points.
Sure.
So, Mr. Tkachuk?
Yes, thanks for that. That was quite remarkable, actually. What I wanted to ask you, when you talked about the payment and the fact that it takes 10 minutes to finally move the key that I have, or a portion of the key that I have to, or the asset that I have to somebody else, can you make multiple payments? So can I pay 3 things at one time, or do I have to make every transaction separate? How does that operate?
Sure. So the basic rule is you can do multiple payments, so you can bundle it together. So the way it works is with sort of inflows and outflows. So in a transaction, there'll be a bunch of money that comes into the transaction. There'll be a bunch of money that comes out. So you can think of it as input addresses and then output addresses. And if you're paying 5 people from 5 different accounts, you can put that all together in one transaction. You'll probably get lower fees by bundling it together. And so it's an advantage to do that. The only rule is that you can't send, if you have an input, you can't send it to 2 places at once. And so that would be called a double spend. And so it's obvious why you shouldn't be able to double spend. And so what the computers are doing when they update the ledgers, they're just making sure that when an input comes into a transaction, that it hasn't been spent in any other transaction.
Why does the Bitcoin itself, because it has such big valuations, and it moves up and down, why does it do that? I mean, it seems to me, if I'm paying for a piece of digital currency, so I pay, let's say I pay $100 for a Bitcoin, and so I put that much cash. I need cash to get a Bitcoin. Otherwise, there is no Bitcoin. So I need cash to get a Bitcoin. I pay $100 for it. And my view is that it would be stored in that $100 is now stored in that Bitcoin so that it can be released to someone else who I'm buying something from. Why does it increase in value? Or decrease in value? Well,
right. So I guess I don't view it necessarily as being stored. That's one way of thinking about it. If you trace the Bitcoin that you buy for $100, let's go back to where it comes from in the very beginning. In the very beginning, it will be mined by a computer, which means it just comes out of thin air, essentially. So this Bitcoin comes out of thin air, and then if there's a demand for Bitcoin, someone will pay $100 for it, and so the miner will sell that for $100, and then you'll spend that Bitcoin, someone else will have it, and then maybe they'll sell it later for $150, or the price will change. So the price is closer to about $500 for a Bitcoin. So it's kind of like a commodity, I suppose, in that standpoint. And as to why the exchange rate is so volatile, I'm not sure we know. It's first off, you have to figure out who's holding Bitcoins and why they're holding Bitcoins, right? Because it doesn't pay any interest, for example. Right. And so why would you hold Bitcoins instead of holding cash if you're not going to earn interest? So some people might argue that it's deflationary, so that you might expect a rate of return. A lot of people are just speculators. They think that the price may increase, and so that may be why they hold on to it. So we don't know the answers to that, but I think trying to answer that question may lead us to being able to model the volatility better.
Is it like I find it difficult. Commodities are something. I mean, people there has to be some input into the commodity, to corn, oil. There has to be some input into that commodity, some cash, something to create something real, right? So people eat or whatever. Yeah. But this thing, there's no input except it's produced, and as you say, there's nothing there except what I'm willing to pay for it.
Right. So I think maybe what it derives its value from is scarcity. So you can't just go out and make a string of bits that is equivalent to something that would be a Bitcoin. And so because it's scarce, then that's maybe where it derives its value from.
Okay. Can you deposit Bitcoins anywhere else outside of the ledger? Is there any banks that actually take Bitcoins?
So there's no banks that I'm aware of that take Bitcoins. It's possible that they exist in other countries. Right. There are exchanges online, and the way an exchange works is what you do is you actually deposit your Bitcoins with them, and you deposit your fiat currency with them. So they hold it in street name, and then the transaction just moves the money from they're within their own company from one customer's account to the other person's account. So they will hold it for you. There's other services that also will hold your Bitcoin. This is more of a convenience for users so that you have easy access to your Bitcoins. If you sit down at a new computer and your Bitcoins are on one computer, the signing authority over the Bitcoins are on one computer, and you want to use it from a second computer, that's a substantial problem. And so it's more addressed at solving that problem as opposed to them actually wanting to hold your Bitcoins, for example, to loan them back out or whatever a bank might do.
Okay, I'm fine. I have some other questions, but I'll just wait till the round is done.
Monsieur Mosca?
Thank you for being with us. I think I heard you say that there's no question that the Bitcoins, the small b Bitcoins, could never be our national currency. I heard you right there, and I think I share your opinion. And so, because the question being is, I know it's gotten very popular, but why is it so popular? And I'll, for instance, I hear people say it's very cost efficient, it's less expensive. I'm not sure that's the case, because obviously the retailer price has to change immensely, and he doesn't deal with Bitcoins. He's probably charging 5 or 10% more. And even when you set off the account, if you go an iCloud or you want to fix a currency, that's going to cost you something. Isn't that a false argument to be cost efficient? That first step is very efficient, but there's all the other steps you need to make to cause a transaction. I'm not sure it's cheaper than a debit card.
Sure. So there are companies, and their business model is to provide basically a Bitcoin pipeline for companies so that users just pay in Canadian dollars. It gets converted to Bitcoin on the back end, sent through Bitcoin, and then the company immediately converts it back to fiat. And so there are fees associated with moving Canadian dollars into Bitcoin and then back the other way. And so those fees tend to range from 0.5 to 1.5%. And so that, I think, is still lower than credit card payments and maybe debit payments. I'm not an expert. I don't know all the numbers.
Well,
but
the debit cards are very, very cheap. It's a fixed cost per transactions, 10 to 18 cents. I mean, it's very, very cheap. Why? When you go to a convenience store, you buy a pack of gum, you're not going to wait 10 minutes, so you can't use it to I'm trying to figure, now, on the issue of anonymity, being anonymous, that's also, and as you confess, that's somewhat also false. It is actually a track record. If extremely important, they can find out. So maybe the drug dealer, whatever, has been using it falsely under false pretense that he thought it was totally anonymous, and he's finding out, oh, look at the FBI recently, they shut down. So I'm trying to figure out, what is the eventual life of this stuff? I know it's very popular now, and I suspect the retailers using this, including the car dealer, I think it's more marketing oriented. It's not oriented at all to fundamentals. Do you share that opinion?
Maybe to a certain extent. I think if you look at the demographic of people who are willing to use Bitcoins, that's an interesting demographic, and so it's totally possible that that companies are using Bitcoins just to appeal to that specific demographic. In terms of going to a store and waiting 10 minutes to buy a pack of gum, that is a drawback. The 10 minutes is a design decision by Bitcoin, so that doesn't apply necessarily to other math-based currencies. And the reason that you have to wait 10 minutes is it's a very technical discussion, but essentially you're worried that the consumer is going to do this elaborate theft where they try and double spend. So they give you the Bitcoins for the pack of gum, and then they also send it back to themselves at the same time, and you don't know which of those two transactions is going to make it into the ledger. They compete. They contradict each other. They both can't go in. And so in the case of things like packs of gum, you probably trust your consumers enough that they're not going to do this elaborate hoax, and they could simply walk out with a pack of gum. I mean, there's easier ways of stealing a pack of gum probably than launching this Bitcoin-based theft. And so generally, there are companies or small businesses that do accept Bitcoins for things like, cupcakes and that type of thing, and they're essentially trusting the consumer a little bit that they're not going to double spend, and so they won't wait the full 10 minutes. They'll just see that it was broadcast to the network, and then that's
so I guess I go back to national currencies out of the question. So it's a convenient form of bartering, a very commodity-oriented form of bartering. So I said, maybe there's a cost advantage, not very clear to me, because they're very wealthy, your price is scary. Anonymity, I say, frankly, those motivated by that maybe should be concerned, but as a society we should be concerned. So what's the next step? What's the national interest? Why would we as a body recommend any form of regulation? It's buyer beware. The guy's buying silver or gold, whatever, the government doesn't guarantee they won't lose money. You mentioned 5 or 6 reasons where we could legislate, but why? Why get into this? Where's the national interest?
Right. So I think it does go with the cost advantage, but it's not for the types of transactions that you're thinking of, like the mainstream transactions. There's other transactions that are much more difficult to do. For example, if I want to send money overseas, my brother lives in Kiev, Ukraine. If I want to send him some money, that's really hard to do with the banking system. There's going to be large delays. There'll be large fees. I can send him Bitcoin, and even if it takes 10 minutes for it to clear, or an hour for it to fully clear, that's still a very fast transaction, and it's low fees. So things like the remittance market, I think it's interesting in those cases. And just generally, if you think about the internet also, it's purely digital, and it doesn't know international boundaries. And so this is a currency that I think is perfectly designed for basically transacting online.
Especially in countries, and not Canada, especially in countries whereby either there's significant inflation in currency, where you can't trust a local currency, or you think the fees are disadvantaged. But as you know, the more you regulate, and if you try to achieve the same form of comfort as you get from national currency, there goes your fees again. So I can appreciate certain countries are not, but even then, that country, if you send to your brother-in-law in Bulgaria, I'm not sure you'll be able to convert the Bitcoins to real currency, to buy a pack of gum or whatever. I'm not so sure.
That's correct. So you do need to find an exchange on the other end to convert it, for it to be useful, or you have to transact directly in Bitcoin.
Thank you, Chair. Merci.
Monsieur Black.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. Clark, thanks for being here. That was very helpful. It was helpful in terms of the technical discussion, but I want to take you, if you're comfortable, to a discussion about what the future might look like.
Sure.
I take from your comments, the very end of your comments, that you believe that Bitcoin is likely a step on the innovation road for digital currencies. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. So let's just go down that road a little bit. What role do you see digital currencies playing in the Canadian economy 3 to 5 years from now?
So I think they'll have a more prominent role to play, especially for online transactions. So we have seen some major retailers start accepting Bitcoin. So Tiger Direct is one that has a Canadian presence. And so I think you'll see that you'll be able to go online and buy things with Bitcoin with more sites than you will today. I think that I mentioned the programmability of money. That's maybe more than 3 to 5 years out. But I think we'll see other currencies that really enhance that feature of the currency. And whether that's added to Bitcoin itself or there's another currency that comes along and replaces it, I think there's exciting opportunities in that space as well.
So I take from that you don't see digital currencies going away.
That's correct. I would be very surprised at this point that they would go away. Yeah.
I see.
Unless if there was like sort of draconian measures taken by governments to shut them down.
Right. So in terms of Canada's position, is there an opportunity for Canada to play globally in some kind of role? Is there a first mover advantage to Canada, in your view?
So in terms of, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Because if you regulate and you get it wrong and you don't have the opportunity to learn from what other countries did in terms of regulation, it's a bit dangerous. At the other hand, once you get regulations in place, I think it gives a lot of confidence to entrepreneurs who want to innovate in this space. And right now, there's a lot of question marks around it. They have trouble dealing with traditional banks just because it's sort of up in the air. So I would say there is a first mover advantage in the sense of instilling confidence, which will lead to entrepreneurship, which will lead to innovation for the Canadian economy. But as I said, there's also a risk to moving first.
Dr. Clark, my last question is, are you aware of something called the Mint chip, a digital currency developed by the Canadian Mint, apparently?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you share with that? What do you know about that?
So I don't know all the technical details of it. My understanding is that it's still based on Canadian currency. So it's not a digital currency, it's just a digital representation. So earlier I mentioned the difference, what I consider digital authorizations. And so I consider it a system that's based on authorizing payments digitally, and then how the money actually moves around. I haven't looked at the details of.
So you understand it to be a process as opposed to a currency?
Yeah, sure.
Right, you bet.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Clark.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci. Madame Bellemare.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente remplaçante.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, or replacement Madam Chair. I have two questions. Yesterday we had representatives from the Bank of Canada, and we talked about bitcoins as store of value, and we all know full well that bitcoins are subject to great volatility. Now we know that in some countries there are private organisations such as BitPay that rapidly convert bitcoins in local currency. Are you aware of the existence of those organisations? Now, the people from the Bank of Canada said that the bitcoins were used as a mode of payment frequently, and that people using them globally converted quickly before Bitcoin lost its value. Do you know any of the organizations such as Bitcoin? How do they make money? Do they take risks at the end of the day by converting this currency into local currency?
Okay, so if I understand your question, getting used to the system, you're concerned about what the business model is for exchanges, particularly when Bitcoin is extremely volatile. So what they do is they provide a matching service between people who have Bitcoins that want local currency and people who have local currency that want.
Okay.
And so they do tend to, at certain times, hold a lot of Bitcoins. And so there is a bit of risk due to the exchange rate fluctuations. But their general business model is they will just take a transaction fee for arranging the swap between the two currencies.
Okay.
And so it's sort of independent of what the exchange rate does. They can still make money as long as there's demand on both sides.
Okay. Est-ce qu'il y a plusieurs de ces entreprises-là?
Are there many such organizations, or only BitPay in existence in the marketplace? Yes, indeed. So are there other companies such as BitPay of the same ilk, or does it have a monopoly over this kind of transaction currently?
There's a lot of exchanges.
Okay.
And so, yeah, BitPay is just one of many. And right now, I think we are seeing a sort of consolidation of, so there's the major exchanges at the top, and there might be like, I didn't run the numbers, but my intuition is that it's sort of an 80-20 type of thing where, 80% of the exchange goes through, 20% of the exchanges, but it's probably more extreme than that. I think that the vast majority of exchanges probably just go through three exchanges.
Donc, ce que vous me dites, c'est que BitPay, au fond, c'est une...
So what you're saying is that BitPay is an exchange. It's in fact an exchange that provides a service for the user, but also establishes the exchange rate.
Okay, so the exchange rate is not established by any exchange. It's just established by supply and demand on both sides. In terms of BitPay, if I recall correctly, there's so many of these exchanges, and they all have very similar names. I think that their business model is they do operate as an exchange, but I think they're one of the companies that provide more of the Bitcoin pipe, so that companies can use them in order to exchange like fiat currency into Bitcoin, send it through the pipe, and then have it come out the other end. I forget exactly if BitPay that's their business model, but in that case, they do operate an exchange, plus they have additional services on top.
Mon autre question a trait...
My other question is with regards to networking and to the people behind the scenes. If I've understood correctly, perhaps I'm completely off base here, but when there is a Bitcoin transaction that takes place, the network is alerted by the transaction, and people are there then in charge of solving miners are in charge of solving the mathematical equation. So do we have a sense in the production of Bitcoins what the quantity of Bitcoins is that is then attributed to people who are working behind the scenes invisibly?
So first off, let me try and explain. I'll give you a little more detail of how the network works, and then I'll try and answer your question, which is how many people behind the scenes have these Bitcoins. Okay, so the way it works is if I send you money, for example, I'll broadcast it to the network, and the network's going to add it to the ledger. And the problem is that what you want is everyone on the network to verify that that update was correct, that I didn't spend more money than I have, that I actually have signing authority over the account. And so what you want to avoid is the scenario where the ledger updates too quickly. If it updates really fast, then the other computers won't be able to keep up. And if you want to start from the beginning of Bitcoin time and go through the ledger from the beginning all the way through, you need to be able to do that in a reasonable amount of time as well. And so for that reason, what the protocol does is it puts in an artificial delay, which just slows things down. And so it makes sure that the ledger updates on the order of about 10 minutes. And so that's you refer to a computational problem. So the way they do it is they give this computational problem that's hard to do, and it has nothing to do with, it's not inherent to the currency at all. It's just basically an artificial delay to slow things down to make sure that there's lots of verification that happens. And so, yeah, and then so that's why it takes about 10 minutes. And because there's mining rewards and there's also fees, the miner gets both the fees and the mining reward.
There's fees too. Okay.
Yes, yeah. And they're very small, but there are fees. And so the miner is the one that gets that fee. And so what you get is a competitive environment where all the miners are trying to compete to be the one that sells the block, because they're the ones that are going to get the fees and the mining reward. And because it's competitive, it leads to these sort of roughly incentive compatible things that make sure that all the verification works. Anyway, it's a little intricate, the design of it. And then the question is how much of the currency is held by the miners themselves. And so we know that a large amount was held by the first miner, the first person who started mining it, which was likely the person who created the currency. And so they hold a lot of the currency in reserves. And then it's safe to say that the miners hold a significant amount, but we don't have numbers for what that is.
Do we know how much miners there is?
So we know in terms of computational power, how much power they have. And the reason you can do that is that you can see how long it takes them to solve the puzzle, and then you can say, well, how many computers would you need to solve it? And then you have a sense of how much computation they have.
Are those people at home and waiting for an alert, and then this is how they
Yeah, okay.
work?
So in terms of the alerts, that happens automatically. So there's no human in the loop. It's just a computer that's set up. It receives it digitally and it processes it. Originally it was people at home, but now that the mining reward is substantially high, people have taken a more of a commercial approach to mining. And so people buy specialized hardware. They hold it in typical like server rooms. And so you're not going to make any money mining from home on a computer anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay.
Senator Green.
Thank you very much. As you're aware from your work in the area, we live today in a rapidly changing digital environment, which new products happen all the time, and in fact, the rate of change is speeding up, and it's certainly my perception. So, could we not be in a position 5 years from now or 10 years where you could have 30 or 40, maybe 50 digital currencies competing for space in the international environment?
Yeah, so that's certainly one outcome that people consider. And even now we've seen the emergence, so they're generally called altcoins. They're alternatives to Bitcoin, and there's a lot of them out there. And they are competing to a certain extent, but Bitcoin, is far and away the most prominent one.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is now, but there could come a time, and I suspect there will come a time when somebody will create a currency which is perceived to be better, maybe more anonymous or less anonymous or with lower transaction costs, et cetera, that would challenge Bitcoin. Do you see a time when, so currencies might come and go rather quickly. How convertible are these digital currencies with each other?
Right. Okay, so just to address your first point, it is true, even today with these altcoins that I refer to, they are trying to improve on the design of Bitcoin in some aspect. And so generally they shorten the amount of the delay from 10 minutes down to a shorter time. Some of them are looking exactly at making it more anonymous. Some of them change this computational puzzle so it consumes less electricity. Those are some of the changes that people are interested in. And yes, I do think that you'll see competition. There'll be different currencies, and depending as a consumer or a company, depending on the properties you want, you'll choose the currency that gives you the properties that are closer or as close as possible to the ones you want. In terms of exchanging between digital currencies, exchanges also offer this service. And so once again, it's just a demand-based thing. So if there's a demand for, if I have Bitcoin and I want to change them into Peercoin, and there's someone else who wants to change Peercoin into Bitcoin, then the exchanges that exist today will facilitate those transactions. A lot of them, though, do go through Bitcoin as a common currency. So Bitcoin's exchangeable with everything else, but the other ones aren't necessarily exchangeable with each other yet. But that's something that could change.
With regard to regulation, it seems to me that national regulation is a bit problematic. Would you think that international regulation is required at some level, at some point, in order to be effective?
So I'm not an expert on regulatory issues, so I can't really comment. I know that in other spheres that involve things on the internet, new technologies, and things that people are concerned with, piracy and that type of thing, there are international organizations that try and step in and at least suggest what regulation should look like, and then it's up to countries to sign on. So it wouldn't surprise me to see that, but I have no opinion about whether that's better or worse.
Do you have any Bitcoin?
I do, yeah.
How long have you had it?
I've had them for several years.
You've had them for several years, and
Yeah.
You've watched them go up and down.
That's right. Yeah.
Have you purchased anything with Bitcoin?
No, so I haven't. I've held on to them because I do research in this area. They're useful for me to have for research purposes. And because I bought them, or I attained them, they were actually a gift. I've acquired them through different means, but
Sure.
like the original set. Yeah, they were worth a lot less. I guess psychologically, I don't maybe attribute the full value of them to them, even though they're worth a lot, because I didn't. If I had put out that much money to obtain them, let's say I would treat them with more security than I actually do. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Rivard.
Senator Rivard. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yesterday, sir, we heard a presentation from the Bank of Canada. I won't go over all of it. So yesterday we welcomed folks from the Bank of Canada, and I won't go over all the systems that they talked us through, but what did impress me is that there is a paper called The Potential Role, which I think is an advantage synonymously. They talked about the costs associated with the exchange, payments that are irreversible, and also they wrote a highly confidential nature, not just confidential, but highly confidential. That makes us think of money laundering, and you spoke about it earlier. You intimated that money launderers will always remain faithful to the exchange, but when it comes to bitcoins, it's able to track somebody almost as easily as it would be someone using an exchange. And you've indicated that perhaps that those money launderers aren't interested in bitcoins because the Minister of, or the Department of Revenue, the CRA, might not be as optimistic as you are regarding bitcoins. I'd be interested to hear your ideas.
But the question, I guess, is on money laundering and whether launderers are interested in Bitcoin. So, and in terms of exchanges as well, yeah, as I mentioned, if in order to obtain Bitcoins, you do have to go through exchanges. Right now, there are no regulations on exchanges, I believe, that apply, but I believe that most exchanges based in Canada voluntarily subscribe to the regulations that would be imposed, like under their best estimate of what would happen. And so that does make it less attractive. And then the fact that it is traceable presents new technical challenges because, as I mentioned, law enforcement have pretty decent mechanisms for tracing internet packets. And so you have to worry about the traceability on that front as well. And so, yeah, it's completely possible that money launderers would not actually prefer to use Bitcoin. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah.
Merci.
Madame Bellemare, dans un deuxième temps.
Senator Bellemare, another question. Yes, I have another question. I'm trying to find the source here. I had the sense that countries that use Bitcoin the most often, the United States, Canada, I think Australia perhaps, and perhaps also the UK, England. I'm trying to find my source, but perhaps I'm pulling this out of my head, but there's been no mention of countries that use the euro. Does the use of bitcoins, or is it less encouraged in the eurozone because people already have a single currency, or perhaps that makes it more difficult, or is it the case that there are many residents that use the euro and so it's easier to transact in the euro? Is there any connection with the use of the euro and countries that have their own individual currency?
So your question is if there's any connection between the use of euros, which is already international currency, and Bitcoin. So first off, I don't know for sure. I haven't seen numbers, but I've heard that Germany is one of the most accepting of Bitcoin.
OK. Donc, ma
Yeah.
prémisse était peut-être pas correcte.
OK,
Donc,
OK. Yeah.
L'Allemagne est un grand utilisateur.
So my premise wasn't but was perhaps misguided.
My premise, my hypothesis maybe was not correct.
That's true. And more generally, I think it's an interesting question to think about whether that type of currency which you can take across borders would, like whether Bitcoin competes with that property
That's right.
of currency. And so, yeah, I'm not sure we've seen evidence that it does. And when I certainly think about currency or about Bitcoin, I'm primarily thinking about online transactions as the main potential. So, yeah, I'm not sure it competes necessarily.
OK.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, since I have no other name, and maybe I have a few, at least, question. Your second point was the secure cryptography, that there were some algorithms that were probably very difficult to, but if Mr. Snowden would like to enter into the business, do you think he would have so much problem? Because he seems to be quite good at the NSA in the United States, I think, probably had very good algorithm, and he went into their computer and got the information. So, and we know that year after year, it's not published, but our banks are also victim of some people who are going into their computer. So just clarify me this question of security.
So that's a very good question, which is what we don't obviously know what intelligence agencies know in terms of cryptographic breaks on cryptographic algorithms. And so is there the potential that the NSA or CSEC in Canada have the ability to break things like Bitcoin? So I watched the Snowden revelations very closely, and the feeling that I and most of the cryptographic community got from them is that they're very interested in attacking what's called the endpoints. So if you think of cryptography as a tunnel, the message has to go into the tunnel somewhere, it has to come out somewhere, and that's where they're attacking. They're not actually attacking the tunnel itself. And none of the revelations really suggested that they have any potential to break new things that we didn't know about. So I can't say it's unknowable, but there's no indication anyway that they have special abilities to break it. And then the second point I would make is that a lot of the cryptography that underlies Bitcoin also underlies standard transactions online, like online. If you send your credit card over online, it goes over SSL, which is the cryptographic tunnel that protects those credit card numbers. And so if you, depending exactly on what algorithms they have, but my sense is that any major break that they would have against Bitcoin could apply to those algorithms as well. And so I don't think you go after Bitcoin if you have that ability.
Yes, but you have many others that are creating other currency, electronic currency. So I guess each one has a different algorithm?
Yeah, so in terms of, I mean, I can get into the details. There's basically two algorithms. One gives you signing authority over the account, and that tends to be the same across all currencies. The other is what's called a hash function, which is used into maintaining the ledger, making sure the ledger is correct and kept orderly. And specific points where the hash function is used, that does tend to differ from currency to currency. It's maybe not as security critical as the signature scheme. If you can break the signature scheme, you can basically steal everyone's money. And so that's the most substantial reliance on cryptographic algorithms. And that one, we're fairly confident and secure.
Going back to what Senator Tkachuk said before, saying it's a commodity. I was tempted, and you were talking about mining, those who were mining the system. I had the impression that it would be like when we buy shares when a new mine is being, and there is no production. It's just piece of paper, and we buy the possibility that one day there will be gold or silver or any other. So is there any, I would say, is this image correct in saying that if we buy Bitcoin, because in itself it's a market, the Bitcoin itself, it's like if I buy a US dollar and intend to make money just by dealing with money, I can do it. So I can be in the business of making money with Bitcoins, and I can use Bitcoin to buy other goods. So my question is this, I mean, where do you see the development? Is it on the Bitcoin itself, or as a tool to buy? Because tool to buy, I mean, we have all to do all these transactions with money originally to get the Bitcoin. So I mean, why bother to do all of this? Would
Right.
it be better to say that this would be more a business in itself to deal with Bitcoin?
Yeah, so to your first question, there's definitely people who hold Bitcoin for both purposes. One is to transact in Bitcoin, and the other is to hold it more like a commodity, like a speculative instrument. It's difficult. They actually compete, I would argue, because if I buy shares in companies, it's not because I want to spend those shares in order to actually transact with them. And so what I think the main people, like the developers of the software, their intention is to try and encourage Bitcoin to move more to being a currency and not a speculative instrument or a commodity. And so a lot of the businesses are set up around trying to use it as a currency. And that's essentially their business model, is that people are willing to spend these Bitcoins. They don't want to hold on to them. They're willing to actually spend them in order to complete transactions.
Okay, my last remark, I would be tempted to say that it would be mostly people below 30 years old that will do business with that than people over 50 years old. Because I think people have to be really part of the culture of the computer era than the senior citizen trying to do some I look at this and I say, well, I would be, even after a few weeks of meeting with experts like you, I would have some problem to explain that to somebody who are not familiar with that, even though I have received a lot of good information. So I'd like to thank you for providing your part of it, and I'm sure my colleagues have appreciated your knowledge, and this is complimentary, but as I say, I look forward to see what our assistant here in research will produce as a report, because of course they're putting all the pieces together, and we'll have to look at this and see where we're going with that. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Alors, on suspend 3 minutes.
We will now suspend for 3 minutes to give us enough time for our new witnesses to take their places.
During this second hour of the meeting, we have the opportunity to receive a presentation from Mr. David Descôteaux, Associate Researcher at the Montreal Economic Institute. In January of 2014, Mr. Descôteaux published an economic note entitled Bitcoin, More Than a Currency, a Potential for Innovation. This note offers an overview of the Bitcoin phenomena and issues that it raises. Mr. Descôteaux, thank you so much for accepting this invitation to appear before us. You have the floor, and we will follow with some questions after your presentation. Can you hear us all right?
Merci beaucoup. Alors, bon. Oui,
Thank you very much. Yes, I can hear you quite well. Hello to everybody. Hello, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm honored to be here. I'm currently an associate researcher at the Montreal Economic Institute, and I have reported on economic issues for radio and for the magazine CPA. In recent years, I have worked mainly in journalism and writing for the general public. So I'll offer a kind of Bitcoin 101. In other words, I will present it from the perspective of the average person, since I am not an expert in computer science or monetary issues. Indeed, however, in January I published an economics note on Bitcoin, which was intended as an introduction to the subject for the general public. Without going into too many technical details, the document explained how the virtual currency works. It also touched on the benefits Bitcoin offers to retailers and consumers, such as lower transaction fees. These benefits are derived from Bitcoin's main features: a decentralized network with cryptographic security, which do not require users to fill out forms with their personal information or pay transaction fees to third parties to process their payments, as is the case with Visa or PayPal, for example. Now, in the economic note, I also pointed out that Bitcoin has the potential to improve the way financial services are delivered. Perhaps other people have spoken to this point. For example, Bitcoin could eventually be used for international money transfers like those handled by companies such as Western Union, given the relatively high transaction fees these companies charge. I think it's important to say, however, that the use of Bitcoin for these kinds of transactions depends on one element in particular. Transaction fees must remain low because that is Bitcoin's main advantage. And there are several reasons why there is no guarantee that these fees will remain low. We can talk more about that when we move on to questions. In my economic note, I explained the challenges Bitcoin must overcome in order to be more widely used. These challenges include a reputation for use in illegal activities, its high volatility, and security and fraud issues. The most important thing to remember about Bitcoin is that it is a digital currency first, and in particular a payment system. This is demonstrated by the many startups that are constantly inventing new products and services related to Bitcoin, almost every day, in fact. Some companies or several companies offer what is probably the best known and most useful Bitcoin service. They allow merchants to convert Bitcoins to dollars or other currency almost instantly in return for a small fee. Just about a year ago, these merchants were still reluctant to accept Bitcoins as payment for fear that their value would plummet within a few hours or days of the transaction. Now that risk is borne by the company offering the service. One subject that has caught my attention, or the lack of attention, we're not sure, is financial interest or lack of interest in Bitcoin. A few months ago, Wells Fargo invited government officials and other participants to a meeting of Bitcoin. According to a report in the Financial Times, the purpose of the meeting was to explore what kind of Bitcoin services banks could offer, without going into detail about these services, and to try to grasp the possible regulatory implications. You have to understand that the banks, and this is particularly true in Canada, and you'll probably agree with me, are still waiting for more specific regulations on Bitcoin. Many are not offering banking services to Bitcoin companies out of fear of breaking existing laws, particularly on money laundering. However, without access to basic services like a simple commercial bank account, many of these companies may prefer to set up shop elsewhere, which could mean economic losses for Canada. So clear rules could make it easier for banks and Bitcoin companies to do business with each other. Now, generally speaking, I believe that for Bitcoin to continue growing, it needs an appropriate legal and regulatory framework in order to strengthen the confidence of consumers, merchants, and investors, and encourage the system's wider use. Greater confidence could, in turn, lead to greater demand for and greater interest in Bitcoins, which would mitigate the currency's volatility. With more participants obviously buying and selling Bitcoins, the market would become more liquid and price volatility would decrease. So by eliminating investor uncertainty, clearer rules would also encourage investment in Bitcoin initiatives and businesses. Perhaps people interested in risk capital. Governments could also benefit from Bitcoin's potential for innovation and from job creation in this new industry. And I think that jurisdictions that clarify the rules most quickly are those jurisdictions that are going to benefit from the most from the economic spin-offs of Bitcoin. Now, before concluding, I'd like to go back to something I said earlier. I said that Bitcoin was two things, a currency and, in particular, a system. and things that move very quickly in the Bitcoin world, and currently there are several products underway that would use the Bitcoin network to offer expanded financial services. One of these innovations is called coloured coins. I'm still trying to figure out what this is all about, and someone more qualified than I am could perhaps give you more details. But in general, by colouring a Bitcoin, users could trade shares, you issue bonds, or even transfer property in the same way that they now send Bitcoins. So while I'm not a computer expert, I think we should approach Bitcoin as an idea whose potential goes beyond that of simply a digital currency. Now, to sum up, while I can't predict the future or even see how Bitcoin might revolutionize the way we use money, it seems to me that until now the public and the media have focused on Bitcoin as a currency or investment, while its true potential probably lies elsewhere in a form that is yet to be discovered.
To the fact that banks are waiting for more specific regulations, and it was with interest that I noted that at the shareholders meeting of the Bank of Montreal several days ago, that the chair of the Bank of Montreal, the president of the Bank of Montreal, I should say, indicated that they were going to be open to perhaps dealing in Bitcoin if there were regulations brought forward. Could you just comment on the significance of the fact that there is a reaction from one of the chartered banks?
Oui, bien en fait, je pense que hier...
Yes, I think that yesterday in the Financial Post, the CEO of the Bank of Montreal made that exact statement. But obviously, I'm not a banker. I can't speak for them. But I imagine that at this current stage, and we've seen this in the US, there are banks that would simply like to finance a number of Bitcoin companies with risk capital, or perhaps look at corporate banking accounts at a basic level. The Bitcoin network and Bitcoin services aren't something that can be specified at the time for the time being. The banks are currently thinking about this, I think.
My list of questioners, starting with Senator Maltais, to be followed by Senator Massicott. Senator Maltais, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Descôteaux, for your presentation. There are a lot of question marks regarding Bitcoin. You spoke about regulations within a legal framework. Now, for example, does the legal framework governing Canadian banks apply to Bitcoin?
Je suis pas un juriste, évidemment.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but the current needs, well, the first step is to clarify where Bitcoin stands in the current legislation. I don't think we need to invent new laws, but for a bank, for example, the uncertainty of not knowing whether Bitcoin will apply under such and such a regulation with respect to money laundering, that's problematic. So I think we need to clarify the status of Bitcoin. I think it needs to be automatically dovetailed into current legislation. So the devil's in the details. There's a whole lot of recommendations for a whole lot of Bitcoin companies, so it's highly complicated. But at this particular juncture, I think simply clarifying what a Bitcoin company needs to subscribe to in terms of legislation would be a good starting point. So what track should this committee go down to make sure that what you're saying fits into the current legal framework in terms of Bitcoin? Well, as I already said, we need to clarify the Bitcoin status. In the US, currently, the IRS has issued a statement saying that Bitcoin is an asset, it is not a currency, so it is taxable. So if you make capital gains through Bitcoin, you have to declare this in your tax return. So, it's both from the consumer's point of view and merchants. Everybody needs to know where Bitcoin is, legally speaking. Some companies or merchants don't want to accept Bitcoin because they don't know where to put them in their tax returns when it comes to capital gain or income or revenue. So there's no real protection for consumers. There's a void when it comes to the legal framework. If people want Bitcoin to continue to be popular, I think this is unavoidable. We need to fill the gap. Mr. Chair, last year at the Banking Committee, we conducted a study on money laundering. Now, despite the very muscular legislative framework in Canada and oversight agencies, the RCMP estimates that there are between $15 billion and $20 billion laundered in Canada. Now, is the arrival of Bitcoin a new opening for money laundering without new regulation? Answer: well, that is possible. Money laundering, as you say, is a big problem, and Bitcoin is very much on a small scale right now. Now, as far as unlawful transactions are concerned, I think I've heard statistics that the black market in the US is to the tune of about $2,000 billion. So Bitcoin may use unlawful means, but that's at a very small scale. It's a needle in the haystack in terms of the big picture right now. Now, an assessment, depending on how it's done, could help regulators and parliamentarians to better and more wisely regulate. What recommendations would you make to us? Sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your question. Well, if you had a recommendation to make to the committee, what would it be? Well, if I had a recommendation to make, it would be, as I said at the outset, to at least get some clarification about where Bitcoin is, legally speaking, under the current laws and legislation. Consumers and companies need to know what the game rules are. Senator Massicotte. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Descôteaux, for your presence and for your clarification. I'd like to continue along the lines of what my colleague was saying. You're looking for further clarification. I think that CRA and the IRS have stated that Bitcoin is property from a fiscal standpoint. It's a gain or a loss. Now, what else do you need aside from clarification? And why would you recommend further regulation? The cost needs to remain low for it to be competitive and useful. So the more regulations, the more it will cost and it will push prices up. So what regulations do you need and why are they so necessary? It's a very good question because most people, in fact, agree that Bitcoin does require a regulatory framework, but very few people are actually able to say what legislation needs to be changed. Now, from a legal standpoint, myself, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really go out on a limb there. But the costs are to be considered of these regulations. Of course, we need to strike a delicate balance. Currently, one of the advantages or benefits of Bitcoin, as you intimated, was that the fees are very low. Now, if you pile on regulations which would cost Bitcoin companies a lot, well, those costs would be handed down to consumers in one way or another, and we'd lose our competitive edge. So it's a very delicate balance that needs to be struck. Now, indeed, the CRA there has been statements by the CRA. I think the public is not really very well versed in terms of what Bitcoin means from a fiscal standpoint. Now, if there were already rules, perhaps the public would be better, more familiar. Do we agree that Bitcoin will never become the official currency of the country? Well, I wouldn't say that exactly. As I said by way of introduction, I am far more optimistic when it comes to the technology and the networks behind a Bitcoin that is continuously developing and what it might lead to in terms of innovations. But as far as currency per se is concerned, I'm skeptical to the extent that I don't think we really need a new currency, but we always need innovations that cut costs for companies and consumers. Well, I agree with you. I don't think it'll become the currency. The government won't allow this because Canadians would lose flexibility from a monetary political standpoint. You're a member of a political institute in Montreal. You believe in free trade, in the capitalist system. You know, the government doesn't regulate other commodities such as gold and money. There are so many areas where government doesn't regulate. You know, why wouldn't you allow the market to dictate in the case of Bitcoin, just like with many other commodities? Why get involved at a regulatory level? Well, answer. I think that from a regulatory standpoint, as I said earlier, Canada is the second, receives behind the US more risk capital for Bitcoin investment than any other country. And there are a lot of investors that would be prepared to invest more money, but given that they don't know from one day to the next whether Bitcoin will be legal or not, as is the case in some countries, there is a risk associated with investing in Bitcoin. So I think from an economic spin-off point of view, it's beneficial to have clear rules so that it'll encourage more investment. Well, if I understand your comments, you're calling on the Government of Canada to say that in future years there'll be no new legislation that will in fact cause damage to Bitcoin's prospects. I'm not sure I understand your questions. Well, you're trying to ensure that people are assured that that people have confidence that the government won't meddle from a regulatory standpoint in Bitcoin's marketplace. Now, I'm not asking for anything in particular, but so that Bitcoin can continue to grow, I think that we do need clear rules. You know, how does Bitcoin fit into the tax system? We also need clear rules from the government to the extent that, you know, it is virtual currency, we tolerate it or we in fact accept it, and then we let the marketplace do as it sees fit.
By Senator Bellemare.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Alors, merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Descôteaux, for your presentation. Before asking you a question, I'd like to come back to a few words you said at the end of your presentation. You said the devil is in the details. Now, I'd just like to refer to the French part of your presentation where you say before concluding, third line, you say, at this current juncture, there are a number of projects underway. Now, without an S, it doesn't mean work in process, but it means in a courthouse, in a court of justice. So it is true that the devil is in the details. That was a typo there. Now, we talked about money laundering and the dangers therein. Now, many people have focused our attention on the fact that Bitcoin is accepted by a number of institutions for a payment. Now, you live in Montreal. Could you please tell me which companies accept Bitcoin in exchange for certain products or services? In Canada, there are about 100 businesses, I think only 2 in Montreal, primarily retail stores. I think in Montreal, a garment shop. In Europe, US, there are a lot of cafes and bars that accept Bitcoin. Now, I think that the interest in this type of trade is for businesses that conduct a lot of small transactions by credit card, for example, and at the end of the month it makes a difference in terms of paying 1% fees rather than 2 or 3% fees that credit cards charge. Now, I think there are a number of shops and stores that are embarking on this Bitcoin adventure for marketing reasons. For example, a couple of months ago, if you agreed to Bitcoin, if you agreed to the use of Bitcoins in your shop, it was on page 1 of the newspaper and in the news. So, yeah, there are concrete advantages to using Bitcoin. Well, do you think that in the near future, a lot of companies or stores will accept Bitcoin as a currency? Because practically speaking, right now, it's a speculative currency, isn't it? Well, yes, right now it is purely speculative, even though it does have tangible and concrete benefits for merchants. That's a different kettle of fish. I'm not saying that a huge number of merchants will use this technology. We'll see how it plays out. But insofar as transaction fees remain low, which is an advantage for businesses, Bitcoin may remain popular. What you have to understand is that one of the problems with Bitcoins, one of the hurdles to its popularity, is the fact that it is relatively complicated for the everyday person to understand. People don't really get a sense of what it is, and so they hesitate. They're reluctant to invest. So the future will depend on its popularity. Currently there are some stores, this is an increasing number, over a 1-year trajectory. They see that there are benefits to Bitcoin. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. D'abord, je voudrais vous féliciter pour votre note.
Thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate you on your economic note, which I found very clear and very interesting to read. Now, I have a question. You said the devil is in the details, and perhaps that, in fact, caught your attention. There is in fact, a footnote, note 9. You talked about BitPay company, which plays a role in terms of converting Bitcoin into official currency. And it says in your footnote that the website for BitPay says that it provides this service for 12,000 businesses and charitable organizations. Now, charitable organizations, that's what struck me. We know that Bitcoins are used often for international transactions, but where did you come up with this charitable organizations? If they're in your footnote there, they must be regular transactors. It's not an anomaly, I don't think. I'd just like your response to that. That's my first question. Well, that's a highly interesting observation that you've made. I have not, unfortunately, delved deeply into the issue of charitable organizations, but I often do hear that charitable organizations do use Bitcoin. There are a lot of donations to charities through Bitcoin. Now, I don't know what the advantage is for charities exactly. Obviously, there'd be something very interesting to find out more about. Second question. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it. People often, it's often said that these transactions which are carried out in a decentralized manner through algorithms, that these algorithms are increasingly complicated. Is the complexity of these algorithms proportionate to the size of a transaction? In other words, when you buy a coffee, it's not a huge amount of money paid via Bitcoin, but will the algorithm be as sizable as if you were transacting, Tesla, for example, a car, Tesla. So does it depend on the actual size in dollar terms of the transaction? Well, I'm not a computer geek, but I think that the algorithm you're referring to is, is a piece of puzzle that needs to be put in place in order to confirm the transaction in a Bitcoin transaction. And, everything is predetermined, preconceived such or designed such that, such that the more complicated the transaction, the more complicated the algorithm. Currently it's impossible to do things from your laptop at home. There are huge computers that handle this, but the Bitcoin algorithm adapts to the speed at which the final piece of the puzzle needs to be placed. So, and this is in compliance with the speed of production of Bitcoins. There are Bitcoins that are being slated for production right through to 2015. So of course the algorithms need to be very complicated because there are new technologies that help people, enable people to hack the algorithms. So we need to keep pace with that. Now, what you're saying is perhaps are transaction fees bigger for proportionally speaking for smaller transactions? No, I think in fact, the overall transaction fee is lower for a big transaction. I think for big transactions the fees are at their very lowest for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is at most competitive for, I think, biggest transactions, but 1% is the highest rate.
That concludes our questions today. On behalf of the members of the Banking Committee, I would like to express our great appreciation for your appearance before us today and helping us with our deliberations. Committee, this meeting is concluded.